Now in this lesson I want to talk about using shape and pattern to design our painting. And if we think about our painting as something to be designed and composed as opposed to just copying the photograph, we can set up our shapes bigger and more simple, which makes our values more simple, which makes color a lot easier to achieve. If we get too many details, small shapes, too many little darks and lights, color becomes impossible. And on most good paintings, and the ones I'm going to show here, the shapes are big and simple, and the values are very good, and the color along with the values suggests the light. And what makes it possible is to design the painting more with shape and pattern rather than just copying objects from a photograph. And too often we take the photograph as reality and we just copy what we see. And that's usually geared towards detail and outline. But if we think more in terms of abstract shape and pattern, we come up with a better design painting. And that gets us away from detail and on to what's really important, the big dark and light shapes and patterns that set up our design. And I always want to think of a photograph as something to be designed and composed, not copied, because a photograph is just a place to start. This is a painting by E. Martin Hennings, early Taos artist, turn of the 20th century. I don't know if he used reference, a photograph, or a color sketch from outside. I think this painting is fairly good size painting, so it's not an outdoor sketch. But even if he did a small color sketch outside and worked on it larger in the studio, he designed it from the sketch. He took what he saw and redesigned it to create better patterns, better shapes that make a better composition. And if you see a good abstract painting, this is what it looks like. Designed shapes. Now it's shapes for the sake of shapes as opposed to composing the shapes to create a realistic design. But still, it's easier for me to think abstractly when I'm doing those shapes. That way I don't get caught up, like in this shrubbery, get caught up too much in the detail. Now I can choose to add some detail, like there is down in here, and of course on the figure. But most of it's just simple pattern. The dominant dark hills, which are a cloud shadow, that's why they're so dark, really make everything else pop out. The dark blue hills really contrast the lighter bushes, the lighter snow. And there's that pattern of dark and light from the shrubbery and the snow. And then the shadow on the snow and the sunlight on the snow. Everything's a pattern. So he's designed these shapes carefully. He didn't just copy what was there, which I think is a misnomer if you're painting outside. Everything is just copied from what's in front of you. That's not the case. You want to move and adjust shapes and size to fit a good composition. And that's what he's done here. Even the clouds, the dark sky, light clouds, are designed to create a good composition. So pattern and shape, less detail, more simple shapes, makes the composition easier to see, and I think as a painting it's more satisfying to look at than one where all the details are copied. And I have a few more here. This is a Marion Wachtel. She was an early California Impressionist, mainly a watercolor painter. I think this is oil. Her husband was an oil painter. After he passed, she did switch to oils, or did more oils, and she really did a nice job. And again, mainly because things were simplified and they're well designed. Very nice design here, but between the shapes in the sky, the pattern and shapes of the trees, and how simple this tree is. There's no leaves detailed and hardly any small branches. It's just big solid shape. Even the trunks and the limbs are just a simple dark and light shape. But less detail, more accurate value, more designed shape and pattern. And you can see the pattern of the light warm violet and the dark blue shadows in the background. That sets up that whole idea of sunlight and depth in the background. And I have another one of hers. And it is simple. It's not very complicated, but I think that's why it works so well. And again, the pattern of the foreground, the green grass, the red shrubbery, it works well. The red and green complementary colors are a strong contrast. as well as the backlit trees against a real light sky, that pattern of dark against light, dark and light in the foreground, simple dark and light in the background. You can see there's a dark edge to the mountain here, and then as it moves this way, gradually goes from blue to violet to yellow-green and gets lighter. And that's about the only subtle change. Everything else is just simple pattern. But very nice painting and not overly detailed at all. Usually the simpler designs are a lot more successful painting-wise. Now this is a painting by Edgar Payne. Same thing. The pattern of snow and darker mountain, pattern of sky and clouds, and then the pattern of the upright trees against the slanted plane of the hillside, and then the dark water and the simple dark and light shapes here. So think of the objects more as shapes and patterns that need to be composed, not just rendering a tree here and 3 trees here, but think of the shape and how the pattern and shape of it fit into a good design. And until you start thinking that way and doing thumbnail drawings that where you're working with the design, and doing small color studies where you're also working with design, it doesn't really sink in. So like everything else in painting, it's all about repetition. This is one of the photographs, and again, the first thing when you get a photograph is to decide how much you can zoom in to what's important. And when I look at this, this is my focal point around in there, somewhere in there. So the more I can zoom into that, the better. So zooming in that much even, and I can pull back and show a bit more in the composition. But that makes a nice composition because of, and again, if I'm really working this out, I'll do 5 or 6 or 7 of these. Pick the best one. In other words, don't just go with the first good composition you come up with. See how many different compositions you can come up with and pick the best one. And when I look at this, what I'm designing then is the shape and pattern of, first of all, that dark shadow pattern that is so important. I can always start with that. And even though there's some light areas in this fencing, it's all part of the dark pattern, because I'm looking at big shape as opposed to small detail. So I ignore the lights in there, at least for the shadow pattern. But then I have the pattern or shape of the ground back in here, which I need to decide, do I need to make that bigger, smaller? The pattern of the upright trees in the background, and I don't like them straight across here, so I might vary the shape a little bit. And then the shape and pattern of these trees too. Do I need to make one bigger, one smaller? I usually want to stagger them, and these are staggered pretty well. Do I need to place the telephone pole over here to balance it a bit more? So a lot of things to think about. And if I can think in terms of shape and pattern, it's easier to design all that. And again, the first thing is cropping, zooming in. And I tend to take photographs that are more panoramic, bigger view, because I know I can zoom in when I get back to the studio. Another one here, first thing I want to do is crop. I like this bare tree here against the dark pine trees, but I would probably move it more towards the center, so I wouldn't leave it way out there. So as I crop, I want that pattern of light sky against the dark trees and pattern of the dark rock and the light snow. It's a real nice pattern in there. So I'll zoom in and crop that. And again, I would recrop 3 or 4 different times, see if it works better more vertically, which it might, or more square, or more rectangular, or more horizontally rectangular. But again, that real strong pattern of dark trees against light sky, dark rocks against light snow, and then the verticals, because there's a lot of slanted and horizontal shapes, the verticals of some of these tree trunks. You know, I can place them in here just to break up these lines, or they're kind of going horizontal or slightly at an angle. It needs some more verticals to break things up. But the big thing is, again, those pattern, the pattern and design of the dark and light shapes. And the more abstract I can think, the better. Like I might want to move some of these dark shapes down into here to fill in this area a little bit more, or drag a cast shadow across the foreground so the viewer's eye can jump over that and go right to the focal point in here. So a lot of things to design. I got a shape here of a tree, and here, and it's too symmetrical. They're both about the same distance from the edge, and I might want to make this one bigger and maybe move this one in just a little bit and get it a little smaller, just to stagger them and create different sizes and make sure they're not the same distance from the edge. So there's a lot to work with when you can think in terms of pattern and design instead of just copying objects. And the first few times you try it, it seems awkward. But just like everything else, stick with it, and you do it enough, it starts to become something you rely on more than copying the photograph, which is what the goal is.